Next person is the Executive Director for the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. And the policy part is critical. That's a big word on how they're going to implement and how they're going to carry this out. And the practice of it is, after your implementation, is how we're going to handle this, what we're going to do. And so we have a gentleman here today who's the Executive Director. His name is Jesse Kohler. Would you please make your way up, Jesse? All right, thank you, sir. Give him a round of applause, please.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm here from CTIP, the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, another organization that Dan helped to start. And I just got to start, and I'll say this probably multiple times over the course of the next hour, how much of a privilege it is to be here with all of you. Since I knew Dan, he's told me so many stories about CTER, multiple organizations and tribes and individuals that he's met all over the country and loved so deeply. And so to be here with all of you and to get to know and meet many of you over the course of the next 3 days is truly a pleasure. At CTIP, we work to build a movement to prevent trauma and foster resilience, which I'll talk more about at the end. But through this presentation, just a quick structure, and I'll get into a little bit more of the meat and potatoes of that with a way that we help to support advocates telling their story, is that first I'll start out with a quick introduction and some PADs. PADs are predictions, acknowledgments, and disclaimers that we can give. I'll go through a framework, the story of me, the story of us, and the story of now. We'll talk about historical, cultural, and collective trauma. We'll talk about neurosciences, neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. And in the story of now, we'll talk about some of the struggles that our country is facing today, but also that hopeful message that we were talking about that Dan carried so firmly within him. And then we'll go with a conclusion, some gratitudes, and then hopefully some time for a Q&A. I don't think that this will take more than 45 minutes, hopefully leaving some time for questions and answers. And if there are not questions, then we'll go to lunch early. So with those PADs, discussions about trauma can be triggering and elicit uncomfortable feelings. Do what you need to take care of yourself throughout this presentation. If you got to step out, do breathing exercises. I trust all of you to be able to take care of yourselves, but just want to acknowledge that up front. Though there is certainly pain in this world, there is an incredible amount of strength to overcome the adversities that we face on an individual, collective, community, and societal level. I will be telling my story, that story of me, but I recognize that mine is just a single narrative of trauma and resilience. Like Andy was just saying, we all have to own our own stories. I want to model how we suggest advocates do that. But there are many unique, different ways that trauma and resilience impact each of our lives, and they are all important. I hope to get to know you all over the next few days and learn from all of you. And then, like I said, won't go too long, don't want to take up time for lunch. So this is the framework that we go with: story of me, story of us, story of now, which helps us during our advocacy calls when we were talking to policymakers. It helps us to humanize the experience of trauma. It helps us to contextualize why this matters to the policymaker or whomever it is that we're advocating to or speaking to. And then we can talk about data, hopes for moving forward, and some of the solutions. And that's just the framework that we use. And so that's sort of the framework that I took for the purpose of this presentation as well. So for me, I just like to start by recognizing that I have the great fortune of having a foundation in love. My family was so supportive, and while they are imperfect, they did the best that they could from the beginning of my life. And while a lot of times we take for granted those earliest experiences that babies have, while they may not have conscious memories of those experiences, those help to shape the foundation and perspective through which they move through the world through their adult lives, right? We'll talk about ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, and how those early experiences shape the perspectives that we move through the world with. But while it was rooted in love, there is complex trauma that exists in my life as well. When I was 13, I choked on a piece of food and got extreme anxiety attacks following that. I couldn't eat solid food for 4 months. This is sort of where I started to develop. While I didn't have the language, trauma-informed care gave me language to understand what it was that I was experiencing. The experience of every time food was near my mouth, I would have vicious anxiety attacks, and I had to live off of Ensure, if you all know that nutritional supplement, for about 4 months to make up for my caloric intake during my early teen years. A big important piece of this is that while I worked to get better and had resources to help me grow through that experience, I could not cognitively get out of the fear of death, right? At a very young age, I was very, very aware of what is called mortality salience, that right around the corner that could come. That was very discomforting to me as an individual. And it took a long time for me to be able to work through that. Fortunately, I had a lot of support to be able to get through that, got back to eating. There are still scars from those experiences. If anybody ever watches me eat, I will need to have a glass of water with me, for instance. But I was able to get through. But 2 years after that, where the trauma started to get complex, where PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, for me started to move toward complex post-traumatic stress disorder, is that my best friend passed away in a plane crash when I was 15, right before my sophomore year of high school. And a few things happened with that. One, I had already been predisposed to fear of death. And then it came that close to me, where one of the closest people outside of my family in my life passed away. Another thing about it is that while I was in school, one thing that we have to keep in mind, and when we don't often take into account the perspectives and paradigms of children, is that when I was in school, everything about school reminded me of Doug, because it was all of our lives up to that point. And I really struggled to pay attention when I was in school, because all that I could think about was the absence of Doug. And so as I had resources to continue to try to help me build back better, build back stronger, and I'll get into, again, that notion of resilience and post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic wisdom, it was very, very destabilizing for me to just be in my day-to-day life. And one thing that happened was that I was diagnosed all of a sudden after Doug's death with ADHD, depression. All of these different labels were put on me by society, when what was really happening, I believe, was that I was just going through the grieving process. And when we talk about trauma-informed schools, when we talk about trauma-informed care, it's that movement from what's wrong with somebody to understanding what happened to them and how that shapes the world and the way that they interact with the world. And while I believe that I just needed time and support and relationships to help buffer the trauma that I had experienced, that loss, that deep loss of a close friend, which I know so many of us in this room have experienced recently with Dan and others, there was this move for society through a treatment model to medicate me, to prescribe me with pharmaceuticals and medications, which I'll get to in a little bit, but I think that created a predisposed idea in my mind that when there was a problem, I should medicate. When there is a problem in my life, I should look toward drugs as a solution. I think that drives some of the problems that we see in our society, which we'll get to. After Doug passed away, I'll get to more, but I was brought into the community of a wrestling team at my high school because I couldn't sleep. I had recurring nightmares, and was brought into weightlifting, even though I was a baseball player, brought into the gym and found a community of people to support me. 5 a.m., I supported them as well, and we were all together time after time in the mornings. And that helped to build the relationship that helped me buffer the trauma and grow stronger through that experience. Moving into college, I had planned to be an attorney, actually, and unfortunately I was arrested for something that I did not do, But that showed me another side of the justice system that I did not want to get involved with, and that was when I got involved with nonprofit work. After I graduated from college, I started to work in Philadelphia Public High School, wanting to provide opportunities for students. And while I had all of those experiences that I had just shared, one of the things that really struck me in the Philadelphia high schools was the outsized amount of stress and adversity and trauma that other people experienced with far fewer resources. And while I knew this from a theoretical perspective, the experiences in the schools really showed me not just how much there is trauma in the world, but also how few resources and how our systems are not designed to support everybody to fulfill success. One of the things that Dan and I really connected on from an early stage and at a fundamental level is that lost potential and missed potential is a great sin in this world, and that we need to create systems and processes and procedures that allow for us to get the most out of everybody, and that's how we can rebuild toward a more hopeful world. And so through that, I essentially got a master's in educational leadership, seeing promise in recreating the education system. During that master's, I worked for the Attorney General's office in Pennsylvania to create a trauma-informed care network. This was 5 years ago now. And that was when I met Dan. And I remember seeing Dan, it was 5 years ago on Monday. So it was December 5th, 2017. And he was giving a speech in a room somewhat similar to this, talking about trauma-informed policy, some of the work that was being done with TERO, and some of the work that was being done with CTIP. And I remember sitting in the back and just saying, I hope that I'm something like this guy someday. And so I just say that to be up here and watching that video of Dan, having been up here so many national conferences, and to have the opportunity to speak to you all today is sort of a crazy full circle moment and very, very special. And one of those things, like Andy was talking about, one of those moments that just helps us continue to move forward through difficult times. But essentially, I'm in this role with CTIP because of Dan. Dan believed in me and provided me with opportunities to grow, to become stronger. And I think that for everyone, for all employees, as we work toward creating a stronger workforce, creating opportunities for people to succeed and those supportive relationships to help people get there is such an important factor that is oftentimes overlooked in this world. And so I just wanted to share all of that. There are some pictures of me through what I just shared. But now into the story of us and the story of how trauma shapes our lives. We need to recognize how trauma shapes systems across the social ecological model. So for those who don't know the social ecological model, we're looking at from an individual to a family to a community to larger, broader systems, states, country, global systems, and society, and how trauma impacts across all of those levels. Oftentimes the onus for well-being in our current paradigm is put on individuals and families, but there's not oftentimes that greater context given for how stress from global systems, from policy decisions, put outsized stress on certain people and families and communities, and how that stress then creates predictable outcomes at the individual level that our society does not want to have. It costs our society a tremendous amount of money, trauma and these unresolved needs, but that onus that we put on individuals misses the broader context for how stress and trauma is oftentimes contextualized in people's lives. We can see how trauma impacts cultures and systems and perpetuates that stress and adversity across populations and throughout generations, which again, we'll get to in a bit. But what we oftentimes talk about is that policy creates conditions for communities. It creates conditions for empowerment, and we know that empowerment is antithetical to trauma, as trauma oftentimes takes that power, takes that voice out of an individual or a family or a community. And we know that democratic systems, and we'll get into living systems in a little bit, how democratic systems are the antidote to trauma, getting input from every part of a system, democracy beyond just voting on election day, but providing input as to how systems are shaping your lives and other people's lives are so important as we create living systems that allow for us to heal across that social ecological model. And the other thing that we really focus on is that oftentimes our society, because of that individual onus, sees treatment or trauma as something that needs to be treated and focuses at the top of this public health pyramid. But we don't oftentimes look at interventions, and even less frequently do we look at preventative measures that we can put in place so that way we ease some of the stress and burden that is placed on our society by the amount of people that are experiencing trauma, by the outsized impact that stress and adversity have on us on a daily basis. And if we're able to move toward prevention, we can ease up the workforce, the burden that we currently have on treatment methodologies to provide better treatment to those that really need when they become so dysregulated that treatment is necessary. But we can also do more as a community to buffer against trauma, where instead of just therapy, we have methods of providing therapeutic intervention through relationships, through caring systems, and providing those opportunities for support and growth over time. So I will take a step back very quickly. Hopefully the sound is working. Sandy Bloom, Dr. Sandra Bloom, was a co-founder of CTIP with Dan. While Dan brought a tremendous amount of policy knowledge, Dr. Sandy Bloom is one of the foremothers of the trauma-informed movement. In her psychiatric care setting, she came up with the move from asking what's wrong with the patients that she worked with to what's happened to them. And she has it's really a half-hour lecture, but I took out 10 minutes of this lecture to help explain in broader context what collective, cultural, and historical trauma is and looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and play that for the next 10 minutes, and then I'll get back on the mic. Hopefully it loads.
This was the way Kai Erikson described it. He said, collective trauma is a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of communality. The collective trauma works its way slowly and even insidiously into the awareness of those who suffer from it, so it does not have the quality of suddenness normally associated with trauma. It gathers force slowly, creeping around one's defenses rather than smashing through them. People are unable to mobilize their normal defenses against a threat, sometimes because they have elected consciously or unconsciously to ignore it, sometimes because they've been misinformed about it, and sometimes because they cannot do anything to avoid it in any case. In individuals, this manifests as a numbness of spirit, a susceptibility to anxiety and rage and depression, a sense of helplessness, an inability to concentrate, a loss of various motor skills, heightened apprehension about the physical and social environment, a preoccupation with death, a retreat into dependency, and a general loss of ego functions. But it's a form of shock all the same, a gradual realization that the community no longer exists as an effective source of support and that an important part of the self has disappeared. I continue to exist, though damaged and maybe even permanently changed. You continue to exist, though distant and hard to relate to, but we no longer exist as a connected pair or as linked cells in a larger communal body. So the recognizable themes that he saw was the numbness and shock that often was first, and then death anxiety because of close encounters with death. People feeling survivor guilt as a result of not being killed or as damaged. The furniture of the self is completely displaced, and what he meant by that was how strikingly dependent we all are on, knowing our neighbors, or at least knowing who they are, where to go for groceries, your corner store, whatever it is. They're all actually part of how we view ourselves and how we make connections. And that furniture in a major disaster is completely destroyed. What accompanies that is a loss of faith in order, a loss of being connected to a community, so the loss of moral anchors, and being completely disoriented and not feeling safe anywhere. Hirschberger described collective trauma as a cataclysmic event that shatters the basic fabric of society, and it's also a crisis of meaning. It begins with the trauma that then transforms into a collective memory and culminates at some point in a system of meaning that allows groups to redefine who they are and where they're going. Collective trauma can, of course, be an important component of understanding the Holocaust. This is from a Holocaust, not a survivor, but the child of the survivor. The children of the traumatized have always carried their parents' suffering under their skin. And she wrote, "For years, it lay in an iron box buried so deep inside me that I was never sure just what it was. I knew I carried slippery, combustible things, more secret than sex and more dangerous than any shadow or ghost." But how did you come by these things? And by what means do the experiences of one generation insinuate themselves into the next? Those are questions we're going to focus on in another talk about intergenerational transmission. Now, the second related concept is called historical trauma, and it's been defined by Chief Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who was also a Lakota professor of social work, as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations. It is related to major events that oppressed a particular group of people because of their status as oppressed people, like slavery, the Holocaust, forced migration, and the violent colonization of Native Americans. While many in such a group will experience no effects of the historical trauma, others may experience poor overall physical and behavioral health, including low self-esteem, depression, self-destructive behavior, a marked propensity for violent or aggressive behavior, substance misuse, addiction, high rates of suicide, and cardiovascular disease. So what they talk about is that there's the historical trauma with traumatic stress reactions that then affect, it really become what we know now as adverse childhood experiences that get then transmitted through the generations, and also are likely to be things that can cause other kinds of trauma in a vicious cycle. Acute problems of domestic violence or alcohol misuse that are not directly linked to historical trauma may be exacerbated by living in a community with unaddressed grief and behavioral health needs. The parent's experience of trauma may disrupt typical healthy parenting skills and contribute to behavior problems in the children. And the additional challenge is that of a damaged cultural identity. Social workers first described historical trauma among descendants of the Holocaust and the children of Japanese Americans that were interned during World War II. And Yael Daniele has done a lot of work on the transgenerational impact of trauma. Considerable work has also been done with communities of Native Americans who experience repeated massacres and the forced removal of children to boarding schools. And then Chief Braveheart also talks about historical unresolved grief. That a component of this whole response is the profound unsettled bereavement resulting from cumulative devastating losses, compounded by the prohibition and interruption of indigenous rituals, burial practice, and ceremonies.
So Lee asked me to make sure that I touched upon cultural, collective, and historical traumas. And while I know a fair amount over the last 5 years, Sandy has been doing this work for longer than I have been alive. And so I figured, why not just let the expert do a lot of that description, and hopefully that helps to contextualize and give some good information about concepts of historical, collective, and cultural traumas. Now I will skip the stone on, yeah, please.
Is this available to us?
I'm happy to send these slides. Yeah, you have access to these slides, and that's absolutely fine.
Okay, do you have an email I can get?
I have so many business cards that I would love to give out to all of you. So yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. So when we talk about CTIP, we talk about our work being grounded in what we call near sciences: neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. Again, I'm going to really skip the stone on these 4 concepts, but I'm happy to dive deeper with any of you in conversation. And one of our acronyms that we say, our hashtag that we put on all of our social media, is hope is near. We talk about how healthy outcomes from positive experiences is all about neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. Understanding these sciences changes the way that we see other people, the way that we see communities, and the way that we interact with the world and ourselves, frankly. And so that's why we talk about how this science is why hope is near, and someday we hope to use the hashtag hope is here as big policy changes and all of that. So in terms of neuroscience, again, in terms of skipping the stone, really want to focus on a very simplified model of the brain. And we'll talk about the cortex, the limbic system, and then our midbrain. When we have stress and trauma, we are not able to access our cortex as well, right? We move toward the midbrain. For any of us that have ever experienced panic attacks, and you can feel your heartbeat out of control, you really try to focus on your breath, your body temperature is getting dysregulated, maybe you're sweating and hyperventilating a little bit. That's because we are physically, fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, has shown that we are in our midbrain and we are not in the cortex. And so we're not able to access that long-term thinking. And for people that have either experienced historical trauma or are experiencing chronic stress and overwhelming adversity, a lot of time is spent in that midbrain. So when we try to interact with people that are dysregulated, experiencing traumatic stress, we are trying oftentimes to reason with people that are not in the reasoning part of their brain. And so in addition to this oversimplified model of the brain is a much more complex organ than just 4 parts. I wanted to provide one set of skills that's known as the 3 R's. That when we see someone who is very likely going through a traumatic moment, rather than jumping immediately to reason, which oftentimes leads to an escalation and perhaps them getting more dysregulated and angry in that interaction, the 3 R's stand for regulate, relate, and then reason. We regulate, offer a cold glass of water, go for a walk, help find that breath and just calm down. And then we relate, because as human beings, we're relational beings, and having those strong relationships is the greatest buffer to trauma that we have as humans. And then after those 2 things are done, people are more activated within their cortex, and that's when we can get to reasoning. We can understand what they're going through and perhaps offer some suggestions. And so while I talk about the cortex, the limbic system down to the midbrain, limbic system is where we're very emotional. The cortex is that long-term and complex thought piece. I just wanted to offer those 3 R's as a practical takeaway for what we can do as people whenever we see somebody in a situation like that. Epigenetics in the neurosciences is all about an ongoing development and conversation about nature versus nurture. Essentially, within the cell, there are two main pieces of genetic information that we get. Genetic information provides the building blocks for manufacturers. That's our DNA, the proteins needed for functional activity. Epigenetic markers provide additional instructions. It's an additional protein that can turn on or off different genetic, the way that genes tell us to present in the world. And over time, historical trauma epigenetically can be passed down from generation to generation, predisposing certain people and communities to different sorts of genetic information being carried. An oversimplified model, it's an emerging science and field of science. There's a lot coming out about epigenetics, but essentially we know that nature and nurture both exist in the development of a human being, and epigenetics help us understand that nature part of how trauma can be passed down intergenerationally from generation to generation, as well as hope and other things, right? It's not all about trauma. Again, there is a strengths-based approach to all of this. Adverse childhood experiences, Dan queued up beautifully in his video, so I will not go too deeply into ACEs. But again, there are 10 categories that found lifelong outcomes and consequences to early childhood adversity. So on this next slide, we'll see that strokes and cancer and heart disease are more likely, as well as depression and obesity and smoking and heavy drinking, a lack of high school completion. We see physical, social, behavioral outcomes being impacted by early childhood adversity in powerful ways. And what the World Health Organization found is that in the United States, ACEs cost, from a conservative estimate, so probably a very low-end estimate, $748 billion a year. That was in 2017 that they looked at that data. And to put that into context, the entire Department of Defense budget that same year was $738 billion. And so the impact on the economic toll of trauma every year is so massive that attacking the root cause, addressing the root cause, I should say, of trauma will help us be able to reinvest in community capacity and create perpetuatingly fulfilling cycles moving forward in society. The other thing that Dan and I did independent research on is that in addition to $748 billion, we estimated that, again, from a conservative estimate using population attributable risk data and CDC's death data, 650,000 lives are lost every year attributable to adverse childhood experiences, again, using 2017 data. So from a human toll and from an economic toll and from a social toll as a whole, we really need to do a better job of addressing the root driver of as trauma rather than independent silos, which I'll get to in a second, what we call a syndemic. And the last thing that I just want to share is that there is hope and that we all have this inherent strength and ability to combat the adversity that we face throughout our lives, what we call resilience or healing. There are many, many different words for this. And again, like I said, healthy relationships are the greatest buffer that humans have to trauma. Healing takes place in the context of healthy relationships over time, is a quote by a really well-known psychiatrist named Dr. Bruce Perry. And let me check time very quickly. When I was lifting, I talked about my wrestling buddies and the weightlifting that I did. While I built physical strength, right, I wasn't immediately loaded with 400 or 500 pounds to squat. That would have crushed me, right? We graded the amount of weight. We started small. I worked on form and always had a spotter, that relationship that's so important, and providing digestible amounts of stress so that way I could build strength to take on more stress and be able to lift more weight over time. Usually I go into a much longer story about how that impacts resilience, but essentially the way that we build strength and muscles physically is similar to the way that we can build strength to the adversity that we face of trauma. I want to get to the story of now while also leaving time for questions and making sure that we get to lunch at least on time. Society currently faces many crises that have a root cause of trauma. Last year, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Child Hospital Association, and the Child Adolescent Psychiatry Association declared a national state of emergency for youth mental health because of the amount of youth suicide that was taking place. We have rising overdose-related deaths. We have rising homicide rates. We have rising suicide rates. There are climate disasters and different emergencies that we face environmentally at the same time. We are facing a crisis of employee burnout currently across workforce professions, especially those in the social realm, but across. We have major systemic and individual oppressive forces that exist in our society, systemic racism, marginalization, that we need to be able to address. And in many ways, our government is not moving speedily at all to address the major brokenness of the systems that continue to perpetuate trauma and stress and adversity. Obviously, CTER, TERO, Dan showed us that it is possible to move changing legislation and to continue to build upon that foundation over time, so there is certainly hope. But the trauma that we see even at a systemic level within government and the hyperpartisanization, the hyperpolarization that we see within our government and the inefficiencies and ineffectiveness that we oftentimes see out of our governing bodies can also be seen as a root cause of trauma. As I said, we'll get to this syndemic slide. So what a syndemic is, interestingly, the pandemic, because it's the same root word, helped make syndemic a more palatable term, a more digestible term. But essentially, a syndemic is a set of linked health problems involving two or more afflictions interacting synergistically and contributing to excess burden and disease of a population. So what we're talking about is that all of these things build upon each other because of a root cause. So when we look at the root cause of trauma, we can attribute that to suicide, crime, abuse and neglect, even the COVID-19 recovery, and like I said, the governance that we see, poor health outcomes, substance use, community violence, workforce burnout, racism, educational attainment, poverty, intergenerational transmission. And as we fail to address the root cause of trauma and even acknowledge that that is a root cause and try to fix all of these things in silos, we are missing how the continuation of and perpetuation of those outcomes are continuing to drive more and more trauma. We need to really take a root cause approach, and that's what we're trying to do at CTIP, which I'll get to in a second. At the same time, we know that trauma is preventable and recovery is possible. Though this is the current reality and it's a little bit bleak at times, we know that things can get better, and we've seen that. The nurse-family partnerships saw a 56% reduction in emergency room visits for mothers and children. In Texas, we saw a 98% reduction in school suspension rates from a school. I want to highlight the San Carlo Apache Reservation schools. I know Donna Manuelito. The San Carlo Unified School District also implemented trauma-informed approaches. And Dan talked about how the school culture when he walked in there from before the school took on a trauma-informed approach to after was completely different, with low-cost mechanisms to improve graduation rates, school outcomes, and behaviors within the school, as well as teacher retention when we get into the workforce burnout conversation. And in the middle there, you'll see that there was a 17 years of work called the Self-Healing Communities Model out of the Family Policy Council in Washington State. They saved the state over $1.1 billion by addressing trauma as a root cause, and I'll talk a little bit more here about what that did. As you can see on the right, and we'll go a little bit more into the data, we saw in the purple line are the communities that the Family Policy Council funded and worked with. The green lines are the ones that did not. Across child injury hospitalization, suicide and suicide attempts, alcohol arrests, hospitalizations, infant mortality, filing for juvenile offenders or offenses, over just a 10-year span, we saw the rates reduce when there was a community-wide trauma-informed approach to all of those to trauma, which then impacted the prevalence of the rates of many social outcomes that we were trying to address. So rather than addressing each of those in silos, by addressing the root cause of that syndemic, we were able to reduce the rates sustainably over time, and therefore also experience an economic benefit as well as a social benefit that allowed for that reinvestment in community to take place. The self-healing communities model ended. The Family Policy Council stopped this work in 2011 when there was a partisan shift within the state following the 2008 recession, and they stopped the program, which is a real shame. But we are working on policies at the federal level that would allow for us to replicate this, as well as the practices outside of just what policy can create conditions for, that will allow for us to continue to make these investments in communities over time. The self-healing communities model focused on community, building community capacity, and through that expanding leadership, there was a focus on the focus of trauma, learning around ACEs and trauma, and a focus on what sort of results were being measured. They wanted to create a living system. Like I said earlier, they were getting input from all people within the community and looking for creative and innovative solutions to address the problems that impacted the community the most. And that's how we saw these incredible rates. As you can see here, not all rates reduced, right? Some of these problems that we see in our society are so deeply embedded that we're not just going to immediately see a reduction in rates, but even in those communities that we saw an increase in rates, there was a slower increase in rate than in those that were not invested in. And so we really want to see us recreate, replicate this sort of investment and work in communities across the United States. Wanted to touch very quickly before getting into sort of CTIP specific work, let me do a quick time check, that there is a real need for trauma-informed policies and practices in workplace settings. The Surgeon General just released a report that addressed the need for work-life harmony, had 5 main components of protection from harm, connection, and community work-life harmony, mattering at work, and opportunities for growth as major contributors to meaning and fulfillment in the workplace. And at the center of it was, again, that worker voice and equity, making sure that those democratic processes are in place. We know that burnout is feelings of hopelessness, fatigue, and being overwhelmed from excessive workloads and unsupportive work environments, and that these develop gradually over time. I'm sure that many of us in this room feel that. At times, I certainly do. But again, that gradual progression of burnout, with trauma-informed care, with healing-centered engagement, we can reduce that gradual development over time and create fulfillment in work, right? Create meaning, which is what we want to see. So what CTIP's doing to drive positive change? We shape policy and craft and promote policy that increases and improves trauma-informed resources. A great example of this federally is called the Rise from Trauma Act, which would create a new grant program of $4.8 billion over the next 8 years to invest in community capacity, similarly to what we saw with self-healing communities model. And then the second section of the Rise from Trauma Act is all about training for the workforce across various sectors. And so that's one example. There's also the Post-Disaster Mental Health Response Act, which just got into the ADAA. Today, actually, very excitingly, we were able to get $1 billion in the appropriations bill for trauma-informed supports in schools. So when the appropriation bill finally goes through and the government funds itself, we'll see that investment. CTIP continues to work to drive the needle forward, and we need voices from communities all around the country to help us do that. And I'll show in a second how we are doing that. We empower advocates. We need for individuals in communities as constituents to develop relationships, educate their members of Congress and other governing bodies, and help us move policies forward. Dan was very passionate that he, being someone in DC, had very limited power unless there was a community of people all over the country that he could call upon to reach out to their member of Congress. And building that community, building that groundswell of support to help us shape policy over time and build a movement that can no longer be ignored is critical to our success. And in doing so, we amplify community voices. We're focused on building relationships with people at the elected officials level as well as at the community level to develop relationships there as well as with CTIP as an entity. We foster dialogue to better understand what emerging practices there are, what policy recommendations people would have. We want for this to be a lived experience and shaped process. We seek strategic opportunities to help further policy and communication, to help create those conditions in communities, to create healing and resilience, and we drive racial and social justice. We have many, many thought pieces and are continuing to do work to talk about how there is an incredible integration of social justice and trauma-informed care. And we need to bring those two together as we continue to do this work. As we promote social justice, as we work toward creating a better world, we need to take care of ourselves and those around us because it can be incredibly exhausting work. And so continuing to center those two things together is necessary. And the last thing that I'll share before opening it up to Q&A, I went a little bit long, I apologize. We have an initiative called Press On, which is really Dan's lasting vision for what the world needs and how we will create this groundswell, this momentum that can no longer be ignored and continue to grow over time until we transform systems long into the future. What that looks like is a national coalition, hopefully one day a global coalition, but we're starting with the national level, a national coalition that is connected to statewide coalitions, within which are connected to community coalitions, within which are connected to each person in the community, to help us mobilize and learn about what problems exist in different communities and what sort of solutions are being innovated within communities to help alleviate and solve those problems that we see. We connect those through local and community coalitions to effectuate change at the local level. Statewide entities should connect with those local community initiatives to help us influence policy at the state level to create conditions and funding for the communities within a state. And then across the country, we have those states connected at a national level to continue to drive and propel support all the way up to Congress, all the way up to the White House, but while never losing the focus that what really matters while we do this policy work is the one relationship, that wrestling coach for that kid that just lost his best friend, or whatever the reality of an individual experiencing trauma may be. Never losing the focus that we can create conditions, empower and educate people to develop those meaningful relationships that help us buffer trauma for someone today, and then how that then impacts when that young person or that person deals with their family, becomes a parent, how they then relate to that person. We see not time as linear, but time as very cyclical, and being able to heal generational trauma by providing the right supports. And Dan's legacy lives on through this Press On initiative, and we certainly hope that the organizations within TERO, the communities, the tribes will be a part of it over time as we continue to develop the framework and our capacity to sustain support over time. With that, I just want to thank you. My email is on the screen, jesse@ctip.org. There's a lot more information. Again, I was skipping stones instead of letting the stones sink on a lot of this. There are advocacy workshops to support advocacy. There are different thought pieces, a lot of briefings, many of which Dan wrote, that are on our website, which you can find at ctip.org, ctipp.org. And lastly, I just want to share a picture of Dan and I. Dan was not a big picture taker, at least not with me. But this was us in the halls of Congress from a Zoom call that we were on when we were together. And again, the opportunities and supports that that man provided to me are what we know can exist all over the country, where I was in an unhealthy place in my life, and in 5 short years, because of opportunities and something that he saw in me as an individual, he transformed my life, and that is what we want to see for everybody across the country. So any questions before lunch, I'm happy to take, but I thank you all very much for your attention, time, and all the work you do. So thank you.